Okay, here we go. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Literature Lovers Night Out. Please feel free to enter your name and city or state in the chat box and let us know where you're joining us from this evening. We're happy to have so many people registered for this excellent program. Got a wave here from San Diego. Shorewood, Minnesota, right out here by me. Baltimore, great. Los Angeles, good. We've already got 135 people checked in. Oh gosh, they're coming in from all over the place. That's great. Alabama, Dallas, Michigan, New York City, Boulder, Colorado, Fairfax, Virginia. That's great. We'll give people just a little more time to keep checking in. So thank you all for joining us this evening. During the course of the evening, while each author is talking, I will be putting in links in the chat box for you all to click on and immediately go to either the Valley Bookseller website or the Excelsior Bay Books website to easily order your books from each of these excellent authors. And our co-host stores tonight, Excelsior Bay Books in Excelsior, Minnesota, and Valley Bookseller on the shores of the beautiful St. Croix River in Stillwater, Minnesota, are very glad to have you all with us tonight. We're so happy. Let's see here. Trying to put some links in and not cooperating. Let's see here. There they are. Okay, let's see. All right, bear with us here a minute, folks. There we go. All right, there's some links for the books in the chat line. And you can just copy and paste those into your browser afterwards, and it'll take you right to either Valley Bookseller or to Excelsior Bay Books to get your copies. And we have a little dog joining us out in California at Kate's house. Well, we've got 148 people checked in, and people can continue to tune in as we proceed with the evening. I wanted to say that I'm Pamela Klinger-Horn, and I want to thank you so much for joining us for another round of Literature Lovers Night Out, which has become Literature Lovers Night In since we are being virtual. But we appreciate you tuning in and joining us this evening. On behalf of Valley Bookseller and Excelsior Bay Books, as I said, I would like to welcome you all. This evening, we're very fortunate to be featuring 3 authors with works of historical fiction that all feature strong female characters. During the program, as I said, I'll be putting links into the chat box so you can make your purchases directly from Valley Bookseller or Excelsior Bay Books. Just copy and paste them into your browser and you can fill up your book cart in no time. And you will receive a signed book plate from the author with your purchase at either store until they run out. And the authors all sent plenty, so we should have lots for everybody. I had the pleasure of spending some time with each of these authors in real life in the pre-COVID days. They were always on the list of authors I hoped to feature at Literature Lovers Night Out. And now we can't be live, but it is still an honor and a privilege tonight to be able to host Kate Quinn, Elizabeth Wetmore, and Lauren Willig at this virtual edition of Literature Lovers. If you have any questions for the authors this evening, please type them into the little Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you move your cursor down there, you'll see some icons pop out, and the second from the right should say Q&A, and you can enter your question in there, and we'll either get it answered during the course of the program, or if we have some time at the end, we'll take questions then as well, but we'll try and get to as many as we can squeeze in. Our first speaker this evening is going to be Kate Quinn. So we will have Lauren and Beth click off for the time being. Thank you. There's Kate and her little dog. Kate Quinn is the New York Times and USA Today best-selling author of historical fiction. Kate has a dozen books to her name, but you may be most familiar with her two most recent novels, The Alice Network and The Huntress. The Alice Network was a Reese Witherspoon book club pick and a New York Times and USA Today bestseller and #1 on both the Globe and Mail historical fiction lists. The Huntress instantly debuted on the New York Times list at #2 and was one of the very first Reese Witherspoon picks for her Hello Sunshine book club. Now, hot off the press is The Rose Code, which is another World War II novel based on real events. This time, Kate takes on the story of 3 female code breakers at Bletchley Park. I have no doubt that she will be appearing on the bestseller list again with The Rose Code. Kate is known for her superb writing style and detailed research. If you've not yet read any of Kate Quinn's novels, I encourage you to purchase all 3 this evening. The Alice Network, The Huntress, and the newly released The Rose Code are all available in paperback originals. They're standalone novels, but once you read one, you are going to want to read more of Kate's writing. Please join me in welcoming Kate Quinn to our virtual stage this evening. Thank you, Kate.
Hey, thank you for that lovely, lovely introduction. I will do my best to live up to it. You may have seen the dogs have already crashed my discussion several times at this point. I can't guarantee they won't crash again, either by coming into my lap or I think there's an Amazon delivery arriving at some point. You'd think they'd know by this point in the pandemic what an Amazon delivery is, but they don't. The bad Amazon truck comes, they bark, it gets driven off. So they'll do their part. So if that happens, I'll just stop and wait till the cacophony subsides. In any case, I hope you all have something lovely in hand this evening as far as a beverage. And I've been asked to chat a little bit about not just the Rose Code, but my particular, start as a writer, journey to writing and publication, etc. And I really hope I will not bore you with that. So as far as how I got my beginning, I can, if you ever heard the old phrase, children are made readers on the laps of their parents. Well, I can attest that that definitely does work. That is how it happened for me. I did not learn to read at any particularly young age, but I did learn to love story at a young age. I was lucky enough to be raised by parents who loved stories, who loved books. My mother was a librarian who also had a degree in ancient and medieval history. So not only was I was I listening to stories about the past at a very young age, but I was also learning to, make those stories up in my head as well. And I was running around libraries. So in the library where my mom worked when I was a kid, in the kids section, there was a giant clawfoot Victorian bathtub that was lined with quilts and pillows. And that was just amazing because it was like a ship to the past. Everybody understood that you could climb into it and it would fit, 4 little girls with their Saddle Club paperbacks, or it would fit 2 exhausted moms with, a toddler on a hip or a baby in a snuggly and, like a Debbie Macomber each. And it automatically carried you away into the world of whatever book it was reading, whatever book you were reading. And so I grew up with that whole idea that books really were the absolute journey to the past and the journey into other worlds, for which I am very, very lucky and definitely very grateful that I happened to grow up in that particular fashion. Yes, you're adorable. Go away. I happened to start writing my own stories when I was about 7 years old. I wrote my very first short story. It was all about the assassination of Edward II, which I learned about from my Kings and Queens of England paper doll book. So I was 7 years old, and this story was full of murder and assassination, regicide, adultery. There was a pool of blood. There was, a dagger in a back and a veil stained. It really was probably pretty characteristic for what I was going to write in the rest of my career. But that is how I got started. And as far as my very first novel, I was through a few years older than that. I was 10 when I wrote my first, and my God, it was terrible. It was 121 pages of pure double-spaced awful. And it was something that, it was a lot of wish fulfillment, the way first novels often are. The heroine was also 10 years old and she had a pony because I wanted a pony. And that's pretty much what your writing skills and storytelling skills are when you are that age. But that's how I did get my beginning. And from the age of 10, I pretty much never was without a novel project in the works. So I kept on writing, and I can't remember a time when I didn't want, at some point, think, well, I think I'd like to be published someday. And I can't remember a time when I didn't have, the idea that I was going to be a novelist in some sort of way. It's not what I went to college for. I ended up going to college for to be a singer instead. I studied music. I trained as an opera singer. And, really looking back at myself, it's one of those things I tend to think, when your life plan as a kid is that you're going to be an opera singer, and then your backup plan is that you're going to be a novelist, if that fails, I really think in retrospect, maybe I should have had a plan C, for anybody who has a teenager who's thinking about, careers and so forth. But that pretty much, novelist was my plan B. I'm very lucky that it did in fact work out. I happened to be writing all the way through college, and it was my freshman year in college that I wrote a novel that was this immense, unwieldy thing about a not terribly famous emperor of Rome. And that ended up some years later being the novel that landed my very first agent. Now, my very first agent, as far as, everyone wants to know, how did that happen? How did you, find that first crucial foot in the door? My MO pretty much from my teen years, at least, I think I was querying when I was about 17, 18. I would write a book. I would send out query letters to all of the agents in the literary marketplace who were taking historical fiction, and all of them would say no. And then I would write another book, and then I would repeat this process with a different query letter, and then all of them would say no. And I pretty much just kept doing that all through my early 20s. And gradually I started getting the kind of rejections that said, well, I'm not going to publish this, but your style's not bad, the kind that, have a little crack of light in them, which can be quite encouraging. So eventually, when I was just graduated from graduate school, I was doing auditions for opera choruses, things along those lines. And I happened to get a refusal, which was encouraging enough about my writing style that I emailed the agent back and asked, would you be interested in something else? And so that she said yes. And I queried her with the novel that eventually was published under the title of Mistress of Rome, which was my very first book. I ended up writing 4 novels set in that particular world in first century imperial Rome, which is a period I adore. Ancient world is a first love in a lot of ways. And, people ask why to make the jump to other eras. Well, I ended up writing 2 books set in the Italian Renaissance after that, because I think I thought I was going to, stab myself in the eye if I had to type the word TOGA one more time. So off to the Renaissance I went for a 2-book vacation. And then after that, it ended up being, I think it was late 2014 and early 2015. I'm thinking about what new to write, and looking around for something different again, wanted to change for a lot of reasons. And what I did see at that point was a lot of wonderful articles about the First World War, because it was the 100-year anniversary for a great many things, the start of the war, then this battle, then that battle. So I started looking at World War I and asking myself the question, which really is how I find my stories, which was, what are the women doing? I always want to know what the women are doing, because quite often, that's not front and center in history. It's around the edges, it's in the cracks, but you can find it. So I asked myself what the women were doing, and I looked around for that, and that's how I found the story of the original Alice Network, and that became the novel of the same name. I see I have by the way, I see I have a question in the sideline. What are your puppies' names? Well, I have 3 dogs of my own, Caesar, Calpurnia, hence ancient world coming into that. And my 3rd is Miles. And then I also have 3 visiting dogs, since my mother is visiting. So that's the little black and white dude. His name is Hobby, who I was just holding up. In any case, I'm always happy to interrupt myself to talk about dogs. In any case, back to as far as what the jump to the 20th century, I ended up staying in the 20th century after the Alice Network to write about the Night Witches. And that was something that had crossed my research path a while back. And I'd always been fascinated by that idea. So the notion, that is how it came to be, that I wrote The Huntress after the Alice Network. And then after The Huntress, it ended up being The Rose Code. And that is the novel that I have, right behind me right now. But as far as, not just writing of the Rose Code, but writing all of my books, I'm asked a lot of times, how do you get your ideas? And I think one of the first things that has to happen is you need that light bulb moment, the moment that lights up the inside of your head and makes you think, I could write a story about that. And for me, that almost always is rooted in finding a historical woman or a group of women who have done something truly extraordinary and have made me think, I wish I knew more about this. I wish I'd learned about this in school. I want to shine a little more light about them. And that's the thing that generally makes me think, yes, this is the next story. This is something I can write a novel about. And then as far as how, the writing of historical fiction itself goes with the research and so forth, I tend to think of it as a great big Frankenstein metaphor, where the historical facts, whatever they are going to be the framework, like the bones. And sometimes, if I'm writing in the ancient world, you may only have a very limited number of facts. You've got, essentially, it's like trying to build a skeleton when you've got a few ribs and part of a skull and some toe bones. When you're in the 20th century, you have a lot more. It's like pretty much all you're missing maybe at this point are a few ribs and some fingers, but otherwise your skeleton's relatively complete. So, and then after that, so that's your framework, the historical fact, the bones. And then after that, you layer on top of it your fictional elements, your characters, the fictional story that is being molded around it. That's what is layered on top of the historical fact. And then at that point, just to completely beat this metaphor to death, you run a lot of electrical current through it, and your story hopefully lurches to life, shambles off the table, and lurches off into the bookstores and onto the Kindles of readers around the world, and hopefully doesn't eat anyone. So that's how I approach the writing of historical fiction in general. I've been asked, how many hours a day do I dedicate to it? I generally do everything in the morning that I can, that I have to do as far as daily life, errands, the walking of puppies. And then afternoons tend to be the time I write. I researched the Rose Code for about, I would say on and off. I'd say the whole thing probably took about 4 years, top to bottom. But the Rose Code, I think, ended up being one of the most difficult and complicated books to write. And as far as what it is about, you've heard it's about the code breakers of Bletchley Park. But for a little bit more about it, it's the story of 3 very different women. You have a beautiful blue-blooded debutante, a tart-tongued London shop girl, and a shy crossword-solving spinster, who are all recruited to the very mysterious Bletchley Park, which is a secluded English country manor where the best and brightest minds in Britain work in direst secrecy, breaking Hitler's supposedly unbreakable military codes. Now, you might want to know, why was I drawn to this particular, bit of history? What about it lit my head up and made me think I must write a story about this? Well, at its peak in 1945, there were 8,988 people working at Bletchley Park, which was the hub of intelligence operations in Britain. 6,757 of those people were women. And yet it seemed to me like much of the storytelling and the nonfiction I had read about Bletchley Park centered on a lot of the men, these titanic male figures like Alan Turing, who were, so central to the park's success. And I don't grudge them any drop of ink that was spent on, bringing those stories to life. But I wanted to tell and hear about the stories of the women, because with so many of the park's code breakers being women, what were their lives like? What did they do? How did they spend their time? And did they ever have a chance after the war to dust off those skills that they then had to pack up and put away when peace was declared? Those are the stories that caused me to write the Rose Code and to form that particular tale. And I do hope you will be interested in it enough to hopefully check out some of the links that have been nicely dropped into the chat. So that pretty much concludes my particular somewhat haphazard talk. Thank you for the dogs for not interrupting too much. And I will happily turn it over to my co-panelists at this point.
Thank you so much for that, Kate. I think we will take a little intermission here and show the exciting book video from the Rose Code. So everyone bear with me for just a moment while I click over to screen share. Here we go. Pretty exciting stuff. After the book trailer, it brings me to the question that several people have asked about any possible movie options for any of your books, Kate.
The Alice Network, The Huntress, and The Rose Code have all been optioned as limited series, but that's only the very first step for all three, and that is not a guarantee that you're going to automatically see them on the screen. It's just the first step, so fingers crossed things happen. COVID did sort of bring everything, including everything in Hollywood, to a complete halt. So I have not heard anything more at this point. So, well, again, fingers crossed. We'll see.
And we also had a reader who's wanting to know if you actually went to Bletchley Park to do research.
Yes, I have. I was lucky enough just before the, I think it was 2018, before the pandemic shut everything down, I was able to go to Bletchley Park and spend about 4 or 5 days there researching. It's a wonderful spot. When the world opens back up, I highly recommend going there, make a day trip of it. It's literally like walking into the past.
Is it open like a public museum would be?
Yes, it's a visitor center and a historic center, and they have the mansion and also the surrounding green huts from the World War II era mocked up to look just the way they would have looked when the code breakers were actually working there. With a lot of 40s furniture, 40s props and equipment and stuff all just sitting there, and it really does look as if the code breakers stepped out to lunch and they're going to be back any minute.
That's great. I am going to make sure I put that on my list of things to do when COVID is over. Thank you so much, Kate. We will take some more questions at the end, but right now we are going to go on to our next guest, Elizabeth Wetmore. Beth, you want to turn on your camera for us? There she is.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad to be here tonight. I
am thrilled to have you.
Pamela, I've forgotten. I'm sorry, I've forgotten will you start with an introduction, or
I'm going to give you an introduction? Yes.
I clearly needed more caffeine.
Elizabeth and I had the pleasure of meeting at a Midwest Booksellers convention back in October 2019, long before we had any idea that that might be one of the final gatherings for the book community. At that time, Valentine was a forthcoming hardcover, and I had read the early copy and knew that Elizabeth Wetmore was going to be at this convention with us. All the booksellers were a big luncheon event, and each authors move from table to table and visit about half a dozen tables during the course of this luncheon. Well, I made sure I knew where Elizabeth was, but she didn't come to my table. So as she started to leave, I leapt from my seat and hauled her back and said, "You are not yet done. We have a whole table of people who still want to hear from you." So she very kindly came back and gave us her presentation and made another entire table full of book fans. So I know I'm not alone when I say this, but since its publication in March 2020, Valentine has been a bookseller favorite. It debuted at #2 on the New York Times bestseller list, and book clubs have absolutely loved it for the rich discussion material, the well-crafted characters, and booksellers love to hand sell it to customers because it's always a hit. This month, we are lucky because Valentine is now available in paperback copies, and I'm thrilled to have Elizabeth here through the magic of Zoom to tell you all about this novel and the story of a brutal crime on the women of one small Texas oil town in the 1970s. Marion Winnick of the Minneapolis Star Tribune said, "Valentine joins the best Texas novels ever written." Elizabeth also has some exciting news to share about Salma Hayek developing Valentine for an HBO series. After you hear her presentation, you will have no doubt about why Valentine was an instant New York Times bestseller and a Read with Jenna Today Show book club pick. Please welcome Elizabeth Wetmore. Thank you.
Thanks. It's such a pleasure to be with all of y'all tonight. Pamela, thank you for the kind introduction. You have truly been a champion of Valentine, and I really appreciate it. Two, I want to say thanks to Kate and Lauren for having me along for the ride. Congratulations on your books. I can't wait to read them both. For those of you who are watching and who've already read Valentine, thank you. I've heard from a lot of readers, and your support has meant the world to me and to my family. For those of you who haven't quite pulled the trigger on purchasing the book or any of these books, I hope you'll be sure to buy from Valley Bookseller and Excelsior Bay Books. Librarians and independent booksellers are particular heroes to me. A person who came to writing late, who went to college late after I'd had a few years in the world, and who really looked, I was a person who really looked to booksellers to sort of guide my reading along. So in a lot of ways, booksellers and librarians were my college advisors before I had a college advisor. So, so thank you. Before I dive in, I actually want to ask I want to answer my favorite question that came in advance of tonight's program. And the question was, if not a novelist, then what would you have done with your life? And I should start by saying, novelist may be stretching it a bit for me since this is my first one. This is Valentine is my debut book. So to call myself a novelist might be a little pushing it a bit, but if I hadn't been a novelist, I would have been a forest ranger. And I thought very, very seriously about going into forestry studies when I was in college. So, and I still sometimes fantasize about choosing that as a second career. So I'll just start with, I guess, what they call the elevator pitch, just a few sentences that describe Valentine. Valentine is set in my hometown of Odessa, Texas in 1976. It's an oil patch city in the Permian Basin at the southern end of the Llano Estacado. It has the richest reserves of oil and gas on the planet. And the book explores the aftermath of a vicious crime against a 14-year-old Mexican-American girl named Glory Ramirez, and then the lingering effects of this crime on her and her family, as well as several other women and girls in town. The story is told through alternating points of view, 7 characters in total. Among them, Mary Rose Whitehead, who's a 26-year-old mother of a 9-year-old daughter with another child on the way, who's married to a struggling cattle rancher in town. 10-year-old Deborah Ann Pierce, whose mother has left town without her. And so she's sort of she's kind of running a bit feral through the neighborhood for most of the book. Corrine Shepard, who is a retired English teacher, high school English teacher, who's recently lost her husband. And then 14-year-old Glory Ramirez, a young woman who's struggling to not allow this single moment to define the rest of her life. As I said, the book is set in Odessa, Texas, my hometown. Odessa is a place where the local economy is utterly dependent on the price of oil and gas. And that brings with it a fair number of social ills, economic disparities, environmental depredations, and of course, fracking and horizontal drilling are changing my hometown even more quickly in ways that have long-term effects for the people who live and work there, as well, of course, as all of us, right, who inhabit this planet. When I was a little girl, most of the men in my family on both sides worked in the oil patch for at least a few years. My dad worked for 30 years at the petrochemical plant on the outskirts of Odessa. And it was then, as it is now, terribly hard work, dangerous and poorly regulated. As kind of an aside, I had a summer job after high school where I painted silos and cooling towers out at the same plant where my old man worked. It was hot, terrifying, hard work. And I'm pretty sure it was a program that would never fly today. But back then, they allowed recent high school graduates to climb up several stories onto silos and cooling towers and spend the summer painting them, strapped in with our safety harnesses. I've never forgotten that work, and it really made me see my father's life in a whole different way. And in a lot of ways, I think growing up there, is really those are the origins of the book, right? This is a historical novel panel. My book set in 1976, and that's definitely old enough to be historical. But I am old enough to actually remember that historical time. So, and in terms of the origin story itself, though, I suppose the book really began with the voices of the women and girls I heard growing up. I was a devoted reader and kind of a maudlin kid. And I was also a prodigious eavesdropper. So I spent a lot of time as a little girl sort of sneaking around, eavesdropping on the conversations, particularly of adults, and particularly of the women who lived on, the street where I grew up. And I listened to my mother and her girlfriends, out on the back porch after dinner, talking about their lives. This was a very, very much a working class community. Most of the women that I knew growing up had not been to college. Some of them hadn't graduated from high school. And again, in an economy entirely dependent on the oil booms and bust, I spent a lot of time listening to the women I knew talk about an oil boom, meaning putting a little money aside, maybe sending a kid to college, paying off the house. And an oil bust meant, a lot of people moving out of town or having their houses foreclosed upon. And so, that was really where the story began. But when I began working on Valentine, I realized in very short order that, spending a childhood eavesdropping, right, didn't mean you knew your hometown or understood it at all. And so, as my kind of research into that area, I spent a lot of time reading the history of the area and tried to brush up on my Texas history, and spent a lot of time in the downtown library in Odessa looking through old newspapers. And I took a lot of long drives through the oil patch when I was home visiting family. And in that way, I kind of fell back in love with the land out there. And that was really, in a lot of ways, my entry into writing the book. But in general, I, like all writers, I try to make a habit of being attentive to the world. I'm always thinking in stories. I worked on Valentine on and off for about 14 years. And I don't want to be misleading. I didn't get up and work on it every day. I had to set it aside sometimes for long periods of time to, earn a living or take care of my son, or be a friend, all the things that take you away from a book. And I should say I didn't write my first short story until I was maybe 28 or 29. So, but when you work on a book for 14 years on and off, the world changes and the writer changes. When I began Valentine, I imagined a collection of short stories that focused mainly on the lives of the little girls on Larkspur Lane. And of course, that would have been a little easier in a lot of ways because I was about the same age as Deborah Ann Pierce in 1976, my little 10-year-old character. So I thought that would be a pretty straightforward project. But in short order, I discovered that the lives of the women who lived on that street were far more compelling to me than the lives of the little girls. I thank my son for that, actually, for transforming the way I saw the lives of women and mothers. I was also very interested in the lives of working class women in the oil patch. Initially, I actually had thought that I would have at least a few chapters from the points of view of men, because it was very hard for me to imagine writing a book set in the oil patch without without, including the stories of men. And part of that has to do with how male dominated that work is even today, but particularly back in 1976. I'm going to actually just answer a couple of the questions that came in advance of tonight, because I was really moved by them. And one of them was, what do I believe is the power of literature? I believe the power of literature, there's so many powers, but I think a lot that one of the things literature has done for me, and that's been especially meaningful in the last year, is to often remind us of the nobility of the person. The characters in Valentine were interesting to me because they were women without a lot of resources, without a lot of money or education or power, who, found ways to behave in ways that were so much more noble than they even thought they were capable of. And that's, something that I've seen in a lot of other books this year that's been particularly meaningful to me. I'm always interested in trying to make my work both beautiful and useful, if I can, to shine a light. A lot of people don't know that part of Texas that well, or the oil and gas industry that well. So I'm always trying to shine a little light on something that maybe a reader may not be terribly familiar with, to encourage someone to see things a little differently. And then, of course, I think the thing a lot of us do when we're writing is we hope that we can do with our book what books have always done for us, right? Which is to let us see the world a little differently, and maybe to let a reader feel a little less lonely in the world. Someone asked what the literature was that had inspired me. My thesis advisor in graduate school was Marilyn Robinson, whose work is so elegant and important and smart, but always has a sort of tender eye for her characters. And she was enormously important to me. James Baldwin has been very important to me. Luis Alberto Urrea, Carson McCullers, Toni Morrison, Shirley Jackson, George Saunders, and lately, actually, the poetry of Eduardo Corral. This past weekend, I got a collection of W.B. Yeats selected poems for free at an estate sale. So I'm digging into that. And then finally, and then I'll wrap it up. But someone asked, what were some of the comments that had stayed with me? I think probably there've been a lot, but I think one of the comments that have been most meaningful to me in a lot of ways have been those that have come from readers who know that part of the world intimately and have been delighted to see themselves in the literature of that part of the world. So, and I don't know if there are more questions, but I'll take a look. So
There are a couple more questions. Someone's wondering about the title and how you decided to name the novel Valentine.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I had a lot. Valentine actually, as a title, came very late, very late. In fact, I think I might have changed it just right before we sold the book. And I had other titles, and none of them were thrilling to me, which was weird because I generally feel pretty good about titles. I've often got the title before I know anything else about a story. So it came to me pretty late, and I was interested in the way one of my characters, Glory, renames herself, and the idea of women sort of taking language in the book back as their own. So when you first see the word Valentine, it's in the mouth of of the villain, actually, in the book, and I kind of wanted to sort of seize that back, but it was more complicated than that. Over the years that I was working on the book, I really came to see it as a love letter to the women and girls I knew growing up in Texas. And these characters are all 100% fiction, right? That's the way it starts. You start with these ideas, you start with these voices, you start with people you knew, and then, in very short order, imagination kicks in and takes over. And I doubt anyone would even recognize themselves in this book. But the origins and the real women and girls I knew growing up and their enormous resilience, I think, in the face of some pretty difficult circumstances. So it's a Valentine to them. It's a love letter to the land out there, which is quite beautiful, if stark. And it was also a love letter to just other things. Deborah Ann Pierce is quite a lover of books. This is little bit of a love letter to books, a love letter to college radio, which I can say, and I don't think I'm the only kid who grew up in a remote, geographically and culturally isolated hometown who had their bacon saved by college radio. And so it's a bit of a Valentine to quite a few things. So
We have another attendee this evening who is wondering if you are planning to write another novel that will take place in Texas.
yes. Yes, I am. I'm not sure I'd call it a novel yet. Maybe it'll be short stories, but I have to say, in a lot of ways, those kinds of delineations aren't terribly concerning to me, at least in the early stages. In the early stages, I'm just trying to get the stories told, and I feel like the frame, the type of book it's going to be is something that generally reveals itself in the writing. But yeah, for a long time, I thought I'd never write about my hometown. And now that I've done it, it's hard for me to imagine setting a book anywhere else. So.
And you've done it masterfully. It's just a gorgeous novel. But perhaps you'd like to wrap up by letting everybody know a little bit about the HBO series?
Well, it's the same. Mine is kind of the same stage of the game that Kate was talking about. It's been optioned by HBO for a limited engagement series. Jen Schur is going to be the showrunner. She did some work on My Brilliant Friend, which I loved so much. I loved the books and I loved the HBO series. So I'm delighted about that. And actually Selma Hayek as well. So we'll see. Fingers crossed.
Very exciting. Any kind of an estimated time for when that might become available in 2022, 2023?
I think everything is just so chaotic and up in the air right now, so I have tried to bask in the good news without thinking about it too much, and focus on my own work, and I think part of that's a little protective thing, right? When if the book becomes a limited engagement series, it will become a completely different kind of art. And so I think in some strange ways, I'm already sort of trying to, let it possibly be a different thing. So yeah, I haven't been paying a lot of attention.
Thank you so much. We'll have some more questions at the end for those of you who didn't have your questions answered. But I want to say thank you very much to Beth Wetmore, and we will move on to our last speaker of the evening, Lauren Willig. There's
Hi,
Lauren.
everybody. Hi.
Thank you for joining us tonight. Lauren is an attorney, a mother, and the New York Times and USA Today best-selling author of more than 20 works of historical fiction. Just before the world came to a stop in March 2020, Lauren Willig and I were blissfully gathered at a literary cocktail party in New York City.
Hi.
I knew Lauren from her past works such as The Summer Country and The Ashford Affair, but this was our first opportunity to meet in person. It was fun to hear about her work in progress, which became Band of Sisters, which Lauren will present tonight. Lauren attended 13 years at an all-girls school, and I attended Mount Holyoke College, so we had much to talk about, especially regarding her Smith College graduates that are portrayed in Band of Sisters. I read a lot about World War II, but I must confess that my knowledge of World War I is not as expansive. Band of Sisters is based on real events and a real group of Smith College graduates. I will say no more because no one can tell this story better than Lauren herself, but I would like to start off with her wonderful book trailer and let you take a little bit of a peek at some photos that are included. So bear with me again for just a moment while I switch over to screen share. And here we go.
The Gray Court gates are an iconic symbol of Smith College. But have you ever wondered how those gates came to Smith? Or why they're called the Gray Court gates? In 1917, a determined group of Smith alumni set sail for France to bring humanitarian aid to French villagers right behind the front lines, whose homes and livelihoods had been deliberately destroyed by the German army. These brave Smithies battled German shells, French bureaucracy, recalcitrant livestock, and a British army who firmly believed that women did not belong in a war zone. As you can imagine, the women of the Smith College Relief Unit soon proved them wrong. They made their headquarters at a ruined chateau in a little village called Greycourt. The chateau may have been destroyed, but there were some rather impressive gates still standing. In 1924, the trustees of Smith College installed a replica of those gates at Smith as a tribute to the remarkable women of the Smith College Relief Unit who saved thousands of lives and brought help and hope to so many. You can read the full story of their adventures, drawn from their own letters and journals in Band of Sisters, coming to you March 2nd, 2021.
And fortunately for us, on March 15th, 2021, we have Lauren Willig live and in person with us. So please take it away, Lauren. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I wish we were back in Amy's apartment with a bottle of bubbly, but since we can't be, I'm glad we're all here together on the screen. Kate and Beth, it was such a privilege to get to hear your stories. And I'm just so disappointed that Kate and I weren't in the same lower school, because we could have bonded talking about our favorite medieval characters, which no one else in my first grade seemed to understand when I went to them and told them that I wanted to be Eleanor of Aquitaine when I grew up, or at least write about her. But instead, for some strange reason, I've wound up writing about the 20th century, and in this case, the brave women of the Smith College Relief Unit. And if you haven't heard about them, do not feel bad, neither had I. And I've actually spent a fair bit of time writing about or around World War I, because the funny thing is I've always been much more interested in World War I than World War II. I know it's a horrible confession to make. I think it's because World War I is messier. World War II, we know who the good guys and the bad guys are. It's the rebel alliance versus the evil empire. World War I is a bunch of people blundering into something that you then can't get out of, and the world changes around them. It's the war that was supposed to have lasted 2 weeks and last 4 years, and we developed trench warfare and all these weapons of mass destruction, and people are sitting there in the middle of it saying, how did we get here? How did it come to this? Rather, the way our pandemic went from, we were going to be under lockdown for 2 weeks, and here we are a year later saying, why are we still here? Why are the kids not in school? Or at least I say that a lot. But anyway, so this Smith College Relief Unit, I stumbled upon these women by accident while I was meant to be doing something else, as the best things always happen. In addition to writing my own books, I also write with two really good friends, Beatrice Williams and Karen White. And at the time, we were writing a book set during 3 quiet and uneventful time periods in French history: World War I, World War II, and the 1960s. For the World War I portion, we needed to know what Christmas would have been like in Picardy during World War I. And so there we were madly Googling Pickard Christmas customs, World War I, and up popped a memoir by a Smith alumna talking about throwing Christmas parties for villagers right behind the front lines in Christmas of 1917. And I thought, wait, what? What are a group of Smithies doing over there dressed as Father Christmas? This can't have happened. This has to be fiction. I stumbled on someone's vintage novel. So of course, being a procrastinating author, I dropped everything and I read that memoir. And then I read everything else I could find on the Smith College Relief Unit, which at the time was not a lot. There are a few lines about them in books about Americans who went off to France during World War I. And there is a pamphlet that was put out in the 1960s telling their story through snippets of their letters, very carefully edited snippets of their letters. But I found enough to know that, in fact, this was not fiction. These women were real. They had been there. And their story was more remarkable than anything I could imagine. So basically, we all know about France being occupied in World War II, but what most of us didn't know is that France was also occupied by the Germans in World War I. It was like their practice run. They marched in and they occupied a portion of France once they got stopped by the trenches. And they were not gentle in their occupation. They plundered whatever could be plundered, and they sent all the able-bodied men and women off to work camps in Germany. There are heartbreaking stories of teenage girls being rounded up and put on trains, and their families, of course, had no idea where they were going or if they would ever see them again. They were simply away avec les Boches, goodness only knew where. Anyway, in spring of 1917, the Brits and the French managed to push the Germans back, not far, but a bit. But before they went, the Germans were determined to wreak maximum havoc. So what they did was they rounded up the villagers. They moved them to one village, and then they went back and they systematically destroyed everything in all the villages that could provide shelter or sustenance. They poisoned the wells, they broke the plows, they burned the buildings, you name it, they destroyed it. And then they went back to the villagers and said, okay, you can go home now, thinking that the villagers would sicken and starve and die and be a horrible burden on the French war effort. But what they had not reckoned with was one Smith College alumna, an archaeologist, a humanitarian, and an occasional war nurse who heard the story and decided that clearly what was needed to deal with this crisis were American college women, because, obviously. And so she went back to the States and gave a rousing speech at the Smith College Club of Boston in April of 1917, calling her comrades to arms. And her plan was to take a group of Smithies and go out there and rebuild everything from the bottom up, to provide basic shelter and sustenance, to provide medical care, to provide food for starving children, to get the children back into schools. And on top of that, to rebuild cottage industry, female-led cottage industry, to restart the agricultural base of the area by buying cows and chickens and pigs and seeds and getting all that going again. It was a very ambitious plan, but most of all, to do whatever was needed to get these people healthy, hearty, and back in their lives again. And there was another element to the plan too. Although, this was largely about striking a blow for France and saving innocent women and children, it was also about striking a blow for the American woman, because you have to remember, this is 1917. Women didn't have the vote yet. And this alumna was very aware that this was a question that was up for grabs at the moment, and that if she could get this group of American college women together and do something like this, something this big, since this amazing, that people might turn around and say, wow, look what women can do. It was showing the world what the American woman could do. Of course, if they failed, no pressure there. Anyway, alums donated funds, people filled out this hilarious application form to sign up to be members of the brand new Smith College Relief Unit. It was all gung-ho, but they needed to be sponsored. The Red Cross would not touch them with a 10-foot pole. They thought this was a horrible idea and that the Smithies were going to crash and burn. Finally, the American Fund for the French Wounded agreed to sponsor them provisionally. They were on probation, but this alumna got 18 Smithies on a ship to France with bits of houses and 3 trucks and all sorts of, goodwill. But of course, as soon as they got there, everything began to go wrong. They got to Paris and there was literally no room at the inn. They hadn't booked enough rooms. Fortunately, someone came up with a bright idea of begging space in an attic that they could use as a dormitory, or else the unit would have been split up before they even began. But it went downhill from there. Their trucks wound up stranded somewhere on a dock in Bordeaux. They needed those trucks to get to the front. They needed to get passes. So they were stranded in Paris for a month waiting while the women were loaned out to other relief organizations. And it looked like they might be stuck there forever. They also made the mistake of touring the American Ambulance Hospital in Neuilly, where really innovative reconstructive surgery was being done on men who had had their faces blown off at the front. I've seen the pictures. They were horrifying. One woman fainted on the spot, had a nervous breakdown, and had to go home. So things were not looking good for the Smithies at this point. And Paris itself was a shock to them. Many of them had been to Paris before, but this wasn't the Paris they knew and remembered. All the women were in black. And they said they felt guilty about having all their own limbs because every man they met was wounded or maimed in some deeply terrible way. Fortunately, though, their founder decided that if their trucks wouldn't come to them, they would go to their trucks. She rounded up their chauffeurs, the girls who drove, and they went to the docks and found their trucks in boxes. And the girls were like, yeah, we're not mechanics. And she handed them a wrench and said, you're Smithies, you're smart women, you can do this. Do it. And they did. They got their trucks together, they got to the front, and there they found the situation was worse than they could ever have imagined. And I don't want to make it sound like these are, fly-by-night debutantes. Many of these women had backgrounds in social service work. That was something upper middle class educated women did at the time. It was socially acceptable and gave them real work to do. But so many of them had, worked in the slums of New York or Boston or Philadelphia. but they had never seen anything like they saw in these villages in France. The unit's head doctor, who is a groundbreaking woman in her own right, wrote home that she had never seen anything in her years of practice in the slums of Philadelphia like she saw in these villages. And there is one line from their letters home that really sticks with me. At one of their villages, there were 50 children, not one of them well. So they were trying to deal with all this. And the children, I mean, many of the women were kindergarten teachers. They had experience with children, but these weren't normal children. They threw a party for the kids to let them know they were there, expecting the children to run and play and sing. And these kids didn't run or play. These were kids who had lived through 3 years of war. They didn't know how to play anymore. And one of the smithies tried to start up a game of catch, and a ball hit a little girl who dropped to the ground and started screaming because she had thought she had been hit by a shell. So, I mean, they had so many challenges facing them. And then their agriculturalist didn't show up. There was a woman who was meant to be dealing with the cows and chickens, but she had a job at the Department of Agriculture in DC and couldn't get away till November. So these nice upper middle class urban women were trying to deal with livestock, which did not go well for them. Among other things, they bought 72 roosters instead of 72 chickens. And then we're like, but why are none of these laying eggs? And the French peasants were like, oh, honey, or the French equivalent thereof. So anyway, they were having a really rough time. And then on top of it, 2 weeks in, their director up and resigns. No reason. And this was when I knew that there was something missing, that there was more to the story I wasn't getting, because that just struck me as it didn't make sense. There are vague references to her resigning for her health, but that's after the fact. There had been no reference to her health up until then. And this woman, the unit was her baby. I mean, she actually had 2 babies of her own, but she'd left them home in Massachusetts to go out here and do this. And in fact, gave a speech about it, saying that all was well with her children, and there were other children with whom all was not well. And these children too were precious in the eyes of God. This was not a woman who was going to drop everything and go home. So that's when I knew I had to go back and find the original sources. There was also a line in that original memoir that had really caught my attention, because Ruth Gaines, in that first memoir, I had stumbled on comments that the only limitations to their high endeavor were the limitations of fellowship caused by their own personalities. Now, as Pamela mentioned, I spent 13 years at an all-girls school. I know a lot about limitations of fellowship caused by personalities. Clearly, there was infighting. And there was also another woman commented that she had seen something so horrible that she had to go home and marry her sweetheart because it had changed her view of the world forever. I was like, oh my God, what is the horrible thing? I was texting my best friend, trying to figure out what the horrible thing could have been. So I had a lot of questions, but fortunately for me, the women of the Smith College Relief Unit were incredible letter writers. In their little hovels in the Somme, in the freezing cold, they sat there and they wrote reams and reams and reams of letters home. And there are thousands and thousands of pages of those letters that have been preserved in the Smith College special collections. Now, at the time, I had a 1-year-old and a 5-year-old. I could not drop everything and go off to Northampton for like the 3 months I was going to need to read through this. I couldn't drop everything and go down there for a week. I mean, you know how it is with young kids. This was just not going to happen. The 1-year-old was, well, forget the 1-year-old, the 5-year-old wouldn't put up with it. Anyway, so I emailed the librarians at Smith Special Collections. There had been something on the website about digitization. I was like, I'm researching this book about the Smith College Relief Unit, and there are a couple of things I need. And they were like, well, what do you need? I gave them the list of the files, and they were like, do you realize how many pages of material that is? It's like, yes, please, can I have even just a portion of it? And they were like, no, we'll digitize all of it for you. It just may take a little while. And so the superhero librarians of Smith College Special Collections made the archives come to me. And I read through thousands of pages of these letters from the front. And I really urge everyone. So on my website, there's a reader's guide. It has links to the snippets of their letters that are publicly available in the Smith Alumni Quarterly from 1917 and 18. Their letters are hilarious. They read like, for other Anne of Green Gables fans, they read like Rilla of Ingleside. They're that same mix of self-deprecating humor and snark and earnestness. And the story they told was amazing. The stuff they went through, and the fact that, yes, there was a coup. Their director was forced to resign. One of them did see a really, truly terrible, dreadful thing. And there was interpersonal drama aplenty. But what really impressed me reading it was that, the official story was impressive enough. The fact that they surmounted all these odds, like not being able to identify chickens, or later on the British wanting them out of the war zone, and pulled together and did what they were there to do. But it was even more impressive to me once I read the real backstory and realized how much more they were overcoming than they even publicly ever admitted. So it's an incredible story. And, okay, there's a bit I'm just really want to tell you. I guess it doesn't count as a spoiler because this is all in the public record. So not a spoiler, but at one point in their tenure, the Germans invade. And, this is one of the things where everyone's been talking about for a while, like, oh, the big invasion is coming. And everyone has threatened them with the big invasion so much, it's become kind of a joke. Like, yeah, they said the big invasion's going to be this week. Huh. Anyway, but one misty morning, a British officer rides up through the fog on a horse. You can't make this stuff up. It actually happened. He rides up through the fog and announces, the Germans are coming. You have to get out. And the Smithies get in their trucks, but instead of driving away from the Germans, they drive towards the Germans so that they can evacuate all of the villagers in the path of the German army, even if it means that they themselves are going to be in danger. And that to me tells you everything you need to know about these women and what they wind up accomplishing despite the limitations of their fellowship and personalities. Anyway, so as you can tell, I am madly in love with these women and the material I found. Ironically enough, when I wrote my first book 20 years ago, part of the impetus for that book, I was in grad school at the time and very frustrated that I was writing my dissertation on royalist spies during the English Civil War, and I had not found any caches of secret papers that told me what I needed to know. And my first book, which was about Napoleonic spies and a grad student in London, was written partially out of this disappointment that I hadn't found a secret cache of papers. And my heroine in that book finds a secret cache of papers, yay. And with the Smith College Relief Unit, I feel like I found the historical sources I have always dreamed of. And, it's a story that's better than anything I could ever have made up. Okay, I feel like I've talked for a really long time. So, Pamela, should I be moving over to questions?
It was also fascinating. We were more than happy to listen to you. What a fantastic story about these brilliant and strong and brave women. When the copy of Band of Sisters arrived at my house and I saw it's 500 pages?
Yeah, something like that.
And I thought, oh, yikes. And I think I read it in 2 sittings. And then my mom is like, give me that. And she went home and raced through it. So you will be so mesmerized by these women that you too will tear through the novel. It's absolutely fantastic. I think that we'll maybe have time for everybody to tune back in here. Kate and Beth, if you want to turn your cameras back on, thank you. And your microphones as well. Great. We did have a question from someone who has worked on a historical novel herself, and she is wondering if you think that the market for World War II stories is saturated yet. Kate, what are your thoughts?
I hear that from readers, but I don't hear it I hear the question from readers a lot, but I don't hear it from editors. And I don't hear it from, it depends on the kind of readers you're listening to. If you have readers who are historical readers, they're like, why is everything so World War II centric? But when I read, when I see people, sorry, the sun shifted in my room, so I had to shift my entire chair and try not to be in the sun here. But when I hear it from editors, people aren't tired of it. And when I hear it from agents, they're not tired of acquiring it. And when I hear it from readers who, aren't reading all of this all the time that some of us are, they aren't tired of it either. And I think part of that is because I think there's a sense, in some senses, people are aware that our World War II veterans are dying out. And there is a sense that we should get their stories while we can. Not just the ones who are alive and, but also the ones who have gone. Can we learn more about the things they have left behind? And I think there is a sense of wanting to learn those stories before they're gone. And I think too, that there is a sort of comfort about reading about tremendously difficult times in the past when, frankly, people managed to come through. It's, there's the idea that, okay, it was World War II was one of the most dreadful periods in history worldwide, yet we came through it. We're still here. And I think right now there's a very big appetite for the kind of story that finishes with, yet we're still here. Because here we still are in lockdown a year later, right? And yes, I'm not at all comparing, being in lockdown with our Netflix accounts and our Hulu accounts and our stocked fridges with, some of the horrors of World War II, but it has still been a hard time, and it's a worldwide hard time in a lot of ways. And I still think there's an appetite for the kind of story where you can look at something where humanity rose, and we kind of want to feel that still. I think so. I don't think World War II stories are going anywhere. I would like to see World War II stories expand to something, so it's, we're not always just talking about the same sectors of the world. It is a world war. Let's go around the globe and tell some of the stories that haven't been told before. But I don't think these stories are going anywhere.
That's great. Well, in addition to all of you writing about strong women, you also all have books that provide us with a vision of hope at the end, which is greatly appreciated during any time, but especially perhaps during this past year when we've all struggled with lockdown. Do any of you have any parting words for the aspiring writers in the audience? Beth?
Oh gosh. Well, as someone who turned 52 just a few months before my debut novel came out, I think one of the things that I might have that's helpful to say is, remember that you're on your own timeline. Not everyone gets their first book out when they're 25 or 30 or 35 or 40. There are a lot of people out there. I think women in particular, who spend years caring for children, caring for elderly people, working, all of the above, and I think it can be really easy to feel like at some point, you hit 40 or 45 to feel like, it's just too late. And I would just really encourage people to remember that, your book takes as long as it takes, and your experience in your life that you bring to that matters, and it makes a difference in the book you write. So
Great advice. Lauren, any final words from you?
Well, I would say, years and years and years ago, when I was a grad student in London and working on the book that became my first published book, I had tea with a lovely elderly lady who had been in publishing in one way or another all her life. And I told her that I wanted to be a writer. And she looked at me and said, if you're writing, you're a writer. And I think that's something, especially in these pandemic times when so many of us have been forced to go back to 1950s housewife mode, that it's very important to remember that your work has value. And if you're writing, you're a writer, that this is not just a guilty pleasure for you. It's a real thing. And you deserve to take time to do it. I was actually on a panel at a Historical Novel Society conference a few years ago, I'll never forget, about work-life balance. And someone asked about balancing writing around kids. And a woman in the audience stood up and delivered a tirade about how your kids are only young ones. And if you're a mom, you should not be writing until your kids are out of the house. And at that time, I had like a 6-month-old and a 4-year-old, and everyone else on the panel had young kids too. That's why we were there giving this panel about, juggling writing and life. But I feel like that's something, this woman was very blunt and upfront about it, but I think this is something people get in all sorts of forms, some of them more subtle and therefore more insidious. And so, to any aspiring writers out there, if you're writing, you're a writer, and that work has value, and don't ever let anyone tell you not to do it.
Thank you so much. I think our time is just about up this evening. I want to say thank you very much to our 3 authors this evening for graciously sharing their time and talents with the literature lovers community. You could order any of these novels tonight from either Valley Bookseller or Excelsior Bay Books. I put the links in the chat there. Please support your local independent bookstores so that we can continue to bring you programming such as this. We depend on your support. All of the books do have signed book plates available until they run out. So you cannot go wrong with any of the novels tonight. The Rose Code from Kate Quinn. Want to hold that up one more time, Kate? Thank you.
Get around the glare.
Here it is. Yes. Valentine by Elizabeth Wetmore and Band of Sisters by Lauren Willig. Thank you to the audience for tuning in this evening. I hope you will come back and join us again on April 6th when author Mary Sherritt is appearing to present her newest novel, Revelations. She will be joining us from her home in Portugal, and she will be in conversation with Minnesota author Alyssa Elliott, who wrote Eve. You can see all of our exciting events at my website, which is www.lit-lovers.com. I just put that in the chat as well. There are several events upcoming that are posted, and I also have a few things brewing that I have not yet been able to post, but stay tuned for more exciting news. So please, once again, do your shopping at Valley Bookseller or Excelsior Bay Books and support these independent bookstores and support these fabulous authors who have given their evening to be with us tonight. Lauren Willig, Kate Quinn, Elizabeth Wetmore, thank you again so much. Thank you all for joining us. And until we see you again, happy reading. Have a wonderful evening. Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you.